Hello, Trapped in History followers. Welcome to episode 49. You are trapped in history with me, Robbie Malcolmson. This episode is entitled Heaven's Throne on Earth, James I and the Politics of Divine Authority. When Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, the English crown passed to her distant cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch. James I saw himself as a scholar or philosopher king, an author of theological and political works, including the True Law of Free Monarchies, which described monarchy as both sacred and paternal. He envisioned monarchy as a divine institution, above human challenge, yet guided by moral responsibility. And you could see that he used words and rhetoric such as sacred and divine to cater more to his intended audience of the nobility and the English civilians, because they are of Christian descent, mostly Protestant, but there are still many Catholics in England at this time as well. To him, James I, a good king was not a tyrant, but a father to his people. In his True Law of Free Monarchies, he argued, "Kings are compared to fathers of families, for a king is truly the politic father of his people." However, the English political system he inherited was far more participatory and assertive than the one he ruled in Scotland. The Tudor monarchs under leaders like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, but especially Elizabeth I, had skillfully balanced royal authority with parliamentary cooperation. James I, by contrast, struggled to adapt to England's expectations that monarchs work with, not over, Parliament. James's belief in the divine right of kings ideology immediately set the tone for his reign. To him, kings ruled not by consent of the Parliament, but by the grace of God. This meant that Parliament's authority came only from royal permission. In speeches to the House of Commons, he often reminded members that their privileges existed because the king allowed them to exist, a claim that left many members of Parliament uneasy. While Elizabeth I had practiced a politics of persuasion, James spoke the language of divine appointment. His philosophical difference between a monarch who negotiated and the one who preached divine order would echo dangerously in the next generation, as we will see soon when we cover Charles I, his son, and the English Civil War. Despite his absolute theories, James preferred peace to war. He ended the long conflict with Spain in 1604, pursued cautious diplomacy in Europe, and commissioned the King James Bible in 1611, which became a unifying religious text for all of Protestant England. Yet, his attempts to moderation at times backfired on him. For example, Puritans viewed the Anglican Church that was started under Henry VIII as still too Catholic and not Protestant enough, while the Catholics resented ongoing discrimination from James and his constituents. Later on, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, which was a failed attempt by radical Catholics to blow up Parliament, deepened the suspicion and worsened divisions among the religious populace. James I responded by tightening laws against Catholics, which, as we have known, is a Machiavellian trait, even as he claimed tolerance in principle. Additionally, financial issues compounded the strain. Lacking Elizabeth's frugal financial decision-making, James lavished gifts on favorites and courtiers, forcing him to ask Parliament for more money, something he despised doing. The aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot turned James' already uneasy balancing act into open mistrust between the crown, Parliament, and religious factions. While the plot's discovery on November 5th, 1605, was celebrated as a divine deliverance, it also gave James and his ministers a reason to impose recusancy laws, which were laws of non-compliance or disobedience. And these were against Catholics. They involved fines, oaths of allegiance, and restrictions on worship that alienated furthermore moderate religious people and deepened the divides between the religious groups in England. At the same time, the king's dependence on court favorites, particularly the Duke of Buckingham, angered Parliament and the public alike, who saw actions like this as lavish titles and pensions, enriching a narrow circle while the treasury continued to empty. His extravagant patronage, masks, art, hunts, and gifts was meant to project royal magnificence, yet it exposed a fundamental tension in his rule. James's theory of divine rule demanded splendor to symbolize God's glory, but his financial reality forced him to rely on Parliament, who had become increasingly resentful of his spending. By 1610, negotiations over the Great Contract, which was an attempt to exchange royal income regularly for tax reforms for James, it further collapsed, leaving James financially weakened and politically isolated, an early sign that divine right could not pay for royal debts. As the 1620s approached, James's confidence as a philosopher king clashed with the rising assertiveness of the House of Commons. Debates over taxation and foreign policy turned into disputes over the nature of sovereignty itself. When Parliament attempted to discuss royal finances or the succession, James argued against them, declaring such matters impertinent for subjects to meddle in, he quoted. His insistence on divine right, combined with his inability to manage commissioning gifts, art, or compromise, created a widening gap between the monarchy and Parliament. He dissolved several parliaments in frustration, ruling them out when possible. These tensions created a political inheritance that his son, Charles I, would mishandle completely. But we also need to spiral back to 2 episodes ago when we had covered Henry VIII and his act of supremacy, in which one of the maybe intended, or I would argue somewhat unintended consequence, is that Parliament will gain more power and more authority to hold over the heads of not just other Tudor leaders, but now we're seeing into the Stuart dynasty of England, and eventually leading all the way up into constitutionalism later. But let's go back here to look at James's son, Charles I, and kind of a look at him and what's coming in the next episode. James I believed that royal authority was God's sacred trust, but his son Charles, we will see in the next episode, would practice it as an unchallengeable power. Where James sought to persuade, Charles sought to command. James's intellectual arguments for divine right became Charles's justifications for absolutism. The son inherited not only the crown, but also the debts, religious fractures, and political hostilities that his father James had failed to resolve. When Charles I later clashed with Parliament over money, religion, and prerogative, which is rights or privilege, he leaned heavily on the same divine right ideology that his father James had preached previously. Yet without his father's rhetorical skill or patience, the result was a collapse of trust and eventually, and unfortunately, civil war. Thus, my friends, we come to an end of this summary of James I and the key elements of his reign. He stands as a bridge between the Tudor dynasty balance and the Stuart dynasty breakdown. His theories of sacred monarchy express the high point of absolutist philosophy in England, but they also revealed its limits. This philosophy was also, as we'll see next episode, supported by philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes in his book called Leviathan, in which he writes during the English Civil War. The divine right of kings ideology was meant to unify authority under God. Instead, it set the stage for one of history's most dramatic confrontations between a monarch and his people. In AP European history terms, James I's reign is the pivot point between Elizabethan compromise and the revolutionary politics of the mid-17th century, a reminder that ideas about power, once written, can outlive their authors and reshape nations. So just like we did on the previous episode, and I want to continue this going forward, I want to look at two separate primary sources, this time from the same author, and it would be none other than James I himself. But the first primary source is going to be before he was the King of England. This is in which he is in charge of Scotland still by himself, and he is referred to as James VI. So this comes from the True Law of Free Monarchies, which I mentioned earlier in the narrative. And I decided to grab a small excerpt from this, and then we are going to apply our HIP analysis to this document to get a greater understanding of the nuance and complexity that might go around a document, or it might have led to the document, or what kind of consequences that may arise from documents such as this, or speeches or writings such as this. So in 1598, then at this point, James VI writes, "Kings are called gods by prophetical King David, because they sit upon God, his throne in the earth, and have the count of their administration to give unto him. Their office is to minister justice and judgment to their subjects, to maintain the religion presently professed, and to rule all estates and degrees under them, according to their laws. So as a king, being a speaking law, ought to be a pattern to his people, that their acts may be framed according to the example of his virtue." Now, I want to point out as we read through that, it's a little bit more difficult to understand and follow than what the second source is going to be tonight. But again, I will put this in the show notes for you to be able to read through with me and kind of follow along if you have the ability while you're listening to this to do that. But you can tell that even in the language and rhetoric that he uses, it sounds very King James Bible-ish. It sounds more of that older style English, which makes sense for the 16th century, even though we're going into almost the early 17th century at this point. He also mentions King David by name, another figure that nobility and the civilians of England who are very religious will be able to relate to, and further giving him credibility for his claims about divine right of kings. So for our HIP analysis, let's first look at the historical situation or the context behind something like this written in 1598. Now, as I said earlier, this is written before James ascended to the English throne, articulating his view of monarchy as a divine sanctioned and morally guided rule or type of office. This obviously sets the tone for how he's going to rule later as James I. His most likely intended audience for the True Law of Free Monarchies in 1598 was the nobility and subjects skeptical of royal authority in Scotland, and then later used in England. And this makes sense too, because you can't forget about nobility owning land, nobility being wealthy, a lot of times nobility being members of parliament. These are the people that are going to be naturally skeptical, who also want to either share or gain more power from the monarchs. It would make sense why not only he would be writing to them or speaking to them, but also in this way because they themselves are Christian, whether they be Protestant or Catholic. For our first P of the HIP acronym, we're going to look at point of view. James VI at this time writes as a monarch and / theologian, therefore someone who studies religion on a higher academic level. He sees himself as God's deputy on earth. His perspective merges biblical interpretation with political theory to further sanctify royal power under what we'll call later on as the divine right of kings. The purpose of James I, and at this time James VI saying this, as you can probably infer, is to justify absolute monarchy as both a sacred and a lawful establishment, and giving it theological legitimacy for his kingship. For our second primary source of the night, we're going to fast forward to 1609, whenever James I is speaking to Parliament. This is where sometimes as a student or a teacher, you get lucky for intended audience, and it says the intended audience literally right in the title. So he's given a speech to Parliament, a group that has gained a lot more power since the Act of Supremacy under Henry VIII. And now we're going to kind of see some of the rhetoric that he'll use here, which I think is much easier to understand. I use this one in class every single time I teach Unit 3 in AP European History, and every time I get to James I. And on the day that I introduce Divine Right of Kings, this is exactly the passage that I use. So if you're a student listening to this, well, then you're getting an early glance at this before being able to answer questions on it during our country competition. So let's look at what James I says in this speech to Parliament in 1609. He argued, "The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. They make and unmake their subjects. They have the power of raising and casting down, of life and of death, of judgment and of mercy, and yet are accountable to none but God only." Now let's look at the hip analysis of this primary source passage. This is just an excerpt from the full speech. The historical context is King James I delivering this before Parliament, attempting to further assert royal prerogative, and prerogative again is right or privilege, while defining the theological basis for his rule. His intended audience here being the English Parliament, whose members were increasingly assertive in claims to shared authority, and they further got that compromise with Elizabeth I before James, as we saw in the previous episode. For the point of view, this is a king trying to reconcile his belief in divine right with England's political traditions, revealing both his intellectual confidence but his also political naivete. His purpose for this was most likely to defend divine right and to remind members of Parliament that their power derived from the royal favor, not inherent authority. We will also see this similar philosophy in language from leaders such as Louis XIV of France, who we will cover extensively later on. So just like at last episode, I love giving support and acknowledgement to historians over the course of history, especially biographers and other people that have written about these historical figures or events. And tonight I want to focus on another 21st century historian, also mixed into 20th century as well. Her name is Pauline Croft. She is a leading modern Stuart dynasty historian in England and writes amid this 21st century reassessment, this sort of revisioning of these different historical figures. We can often call this revisionist history. And we can kind of see how she views James and kind of has this newer sort of view compared to what maybe somebody had a more simplified view of James in older parts of history. She tries to add even more complexity to his rule in the way we look at him. So she will give him some compliments here, but she'll also understandably criticize him. Another reason why I really wanted to use this source, and as a teacher or a student, this is another great source to copy and paste in something and hell, use AI or something to create just some practice questions that might go with it and help you get ready for the AP exam or just to challenge yourself as a history enthusiast. So let's see what Pauline Croft argued about James I in 2003. She says, James VI and first was an intellectual monarch who sought to harmonize theology and politics in an age of division. But his insistence on the divine right of kings often undermined his own objectives. His conviction that monarchy was sacred and that resistance equaled sin left him ill-equipped to navigate the constitutional realities of England. Yet James was not a despot. He preferred persuasion over coercion, peace to war. His tragedy was that his ideals belonged to a fading medieval order, while his subjects increasingly inhabited the modern political world of bargaining, consent, and law that we are seeing in this era of the very, very beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, in which these ideas that the people are the ones that give the rulers consent to rule. And we're seeing these ideas clash with not only Elizabeth I, but now James I. And I think we're going to see further evidence when we go into the next two Charles and then into the last James on James II, in which we'll conclude this sort of series on the English monarchs with the Glorious Revolution, when we have the constitutional era come in 1689 with William and Mary of the Netherlands. Let's also look at the hip analysis for Pauline's writing from King James here. The historical situation for her, like I said, she's writing in an era of revisionist history, so she's trying to give a little bit more of a complex view, give him justified criticism where it belongs, but also talk about his intellectual side and give him at least credit for that. Her intended audience, like a lot of secondary academic sources like this, as we will see this year when I'm using these, is more than likely academia and general readers interested in reevaluating early Stuart English dynasty rule. The point of view, again, is that Pauline Croft is a revisionist historian, more than likely, sympathetic to James's intellect, but critical of his political rigidity, blending admiration for his ideas with acknowledgement that they're impractical for the era that he's ruling in. Now, the purpose of this particular writing that Pauline Croft did was more than likely to present James as a complex figure, well-meaning and intellectual, but trapped between the eras of divine monarchy and constitutional politics. I think that's a great representation for the clash that we see when we teach Unit 3 of absolutism and constitutionalism. This may be a really great source to use right there before you're about to start constitutionalism, or maybe right at the end of Unit 3 as showing that contrast between the two. I think it's also important that we kind of look at a couple of other areas that might be more beneficial for teachers and students here. When it comes to writing about the intellectual or cultural developments of the time period, I think as a student or teacher, you don't want to overlook writing about the divine right of kings and how it's a political theory and how it's challenged by the new constitutional thinkers of that era. And I also want to give credit that using this podcast and the one before this about Elizabeth I would be a great opportunity to focus on women and gender in politics. For example, the influence of the queenship under Elizabeth I versus the male kingship reasserted by James I, and that we saw asserted by Henry VIII and the kings before him. As usual, I do want to wrap up this episode by providing 3 philosophical discussion or debate questions that you, as a historical enthusiast or a teacher or a student, could get together with others and discuss these ideas. Or hell, come on the podcast and have a discussion with me on these. My first question is going to focus on the theme of divine power versus human consent. The question is, can any claim to absolute power ever be legitimate if it relies on divine sanction rather than human agreement? The second question of the night will be focused on knowledge versus wisdom. The question reads, James was one of Europe's most educated monarchs. Does intellectual brilliance necessarily make someone a better ruler? Number 3, for the theme of faith versus pragmatism, the question reads, is there a moral danger in believing one's political authority comes directly from God, or is such conviction essential for strong leadership? My next episode will be an interview that I'm looking forward to, and I've been looking forward to for a couple of years now, of a YouTuber and a historian that I've been following for a while, is JD from History Underground. I'm going to get a chance to have a great conversation with him tomorrow night about his channel and his experiences and his opinions on history and maybe why we should wrestle with history. I'm very honored to be able to have that discussion. This weekend, I'm also planning on having a roundtable discussion with Mike and Bob from X's and Joe's podcast over why we should wrestle with history. And peppered in between those, I will do other podcasts over content. So my next content one is going to be James I's son, Charles I, and really focusing on him, and then probably having a whole episode over the English Civil War, and then eventually getting into Charles II, James II, and then concluding with the English side of the Glorious Revolution. And then we're going to start focusing on probably Louis XIV. So as always, I appreciate every one of you taking the time to listen to this episode. And I want to keep encouraging each of you to keep questioning the past in order to understand the present and be contagious.